What's up, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Officer Training School. With the new data slate reopening Lord Solar's ability to order Super Heavies and Titanic units, I thought I would take some time to talk about all the different Super Heavies that we have available to us, which ones are good, and which ones you should be looking to take into your competitive games. My name is Joshua Joushi Howard, and let's go ahead and talk about the Super Heavies. So as always, we are going to be talking about the Super Heavy basics, different ways to think about them, the Super Heavy tier list, and which ones you should actually be looking to take into your competitive games, orders and stratagems, and of course we'll end off with strategy. Now, I want to give a really important caveat here that I have not put in one of my videos in a while, and that this channel is focused on competitive play. If you want to play Super Heavy at home with your friends, play what you find fun. I'm not here to try and police different things that are good and bad in your narrative games or in your small local games. This video is intended for if you're trying to go to a GT and get as many wins as possible at that event. Naturally, the strategy that you're going to use in these events is going to be way different than the ones that you're doing with your buddies. With that out of the way, one of the first things we need to talk about with Super Heavies is that Super Heavies cost a ton of points. If you're planning to take a Super Heavy, it's not just the cost of the tank that you have to factor in, you also have to factor in the fact that you are taking Lord Solar and an Engine Seer to make sure that your tank is as effective as possible and can participate in the game for as many turns as possible. This means at the time of recording, the minimum price you are paying for Super Heavies is not going to be 440 for a Shadow Sword, it's the Shadow Sword plus Lord Solar plus an Engine Seer for a minimum of 635 points. That is basically a third of your army wrapped up in basically just one unit and the support system around it. With this in mind, a Super Heavy being cheap is not a selling point. There is no such thing as a cheap Super Heavy, so you're not looking to take whichever one is cheapest. That is not relevant to your considerations basically at all. With this in mind, Super Heavies have to be the core of your list. You are taking this unit and you are building around it. Everything else exists surrounding and supporting this one unit. So, we're looking for the tank that does that job best. It needs to control firing lanes, it needs to be nigh unkillable, and it needs to be useful in all of our games. We don't want one that is going to be useful in some games and then a waste of 600 plus points in another one. So, let's go ahead and take a look at the Super Heavy tier list. Starting at the bottom, these ones are ones that you should never really be looking to take to a competitive event. They are the Shadow Sword, the Banehammer, and the Hellhammer. Now, I know a lot of people are going to be sad when they see the Shadow Sword in the bottom tier. Especially people on Reddit, especially people in a couple Discords that I frequent, who will oftentimes swear by the Shadow Sword. But there are a lot of issues with this tank that make it not very good. The Banehammer and the Hellhammer are unfortunately just themselves just bad guns. They are relatively cheap for a Super Heavy, but as we already talked about, we are not taking the cheap one because it's cheap. Moving up a little bit, we have the Stormlord. In any detachment that is not mechanized assault, Stormlord is terrible. However, there are some funny things you can do with it, such as putting in a bunch of heavy weapons teams, or Ogren, or Scions, or something, and it's going to run around and do some pretty decent damage. However, by putting all those things in the Stormlord, we are already taking our 635 point unit, and for everything we put inside, we have to factor that into the cost of the Stormlord. So if we put 6 Ogren inside, we're now looking at a unit that costs more than 700 points. If we're putting Scions inside, we're looking at a unit that is plausibly 800 points, and it only goes up from there. The Doomhammer belongs in the C tier, and this one is interesting because this one is much more of a meta read than a lot of the other things on this list. The Doomhammer is kind of in a weird middle ground, and we'll go ahead and talk about it a little bit more later. In the B tier, we have the Bane Sword, the Bane Blade, and the Stormlord in Mechanized Assault specifically. The Bane Sword and the Bane Blade are the closest thing you're going to find to a budget Super Heavy. If you need to find a couple more points and you want to downgrade from a Storm Sword, you can take a Bane Sword or a Bane Blade. And there are a couple of situations where they are a little bit better than the Storm Sword, but we'll go ahead and talk about that in a bit. The only Super Heavy that belongs in A tier, and the only one that you should really be planning to build a list around, unless you have specific meta reads that you're trying to go for, is the Storm Sword. We'll go ahead and talk about that in a moment. Before we go ahead and talk about the rest of the Super Heavy stuff, the thing that we have to talk about is the Super Heavy War Gear choice. Every single one of them comes with stock standard 4 las cannons and 1 twin-linked heavy bolter. After that, you get to choose between 4 additional heavy bolters or 4 heavy flamers. I'm not going to lie here, this is a very easy choice. You want to choose the bolters. This is a unit where the range usually matters, and in games where it doesn't matter, the bolters are almost as good as the flamers anyway. If you're going to go with a Stormlord, you can consider the flamers a little bit more because it's going to be closer because it's serving that transport role. However, most of the time you're still going to be taking the Super Heavy with the heavy bolters. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about why the Storm Sword is the best. And it's pretty simple. It has the best gun, and it's not close. The table that we have here on the right is looking at the main gun only. It does not include the heavy bolters, it does not include the las cannons. This is because every single tank is otherwise the same, right? They all have 4 las cannons, they all have the heavy bolters. This table also assumes that you've given the super heavy take aim and that the target you're shooting at is in cover, which, because this is 10th edition 40k, you should generally assume that most targets you're going to be shooting at, if your opponent is playing well, are going to be in cover. And one of the reasons why I chose the targets that I did is because the Storm Sword is so much better against other targets that are not these vehicles that it's not even worth considering. So to start, with the Leman Russ, a Storm Sword has a 75% chance to kill. We compare this to a Bane Sword and a Shadow Sword, who are both less than 50%, and the Doomhammer is above 60%, but still significantly lower than a Storm Sword. If we upgrade this to a Land Raider, the Storm Sword still has a 63% chance, the only one who is above 50%, and everything else is below 50% likelihood to kill. And then lastly, one of the ones that is the most important is when we're looking at a knight. Now, of course, this is written about Imperial Knights with a 6-up Feel No Pain. These numbers will probably change when their codex comes out, but as of the time of writing, we don't have the full idea of what they're going to look like. With this in mind, you can start to see that against the heaviest of targets, the Shadow Sword and the Doomhammer have a slightly higher percent chance to kill. However, they are on average going to do less damage than the Storm Sword. The main reason why we're looking at the main gun only, and why having the best gun against pretty much every single target in the game is really relevant, is because, one, the Storm Sword with D6 plus 6 shots and AP4 ignores cover means you're going to get close to the maximum number of shots into things relative to some of the other weapons. The Shadow Sword at D3 plus 1 blast is going to get like 4 shots into a major unit, whereas the Storm Sword is looking at least 5 more attacks into the same unit. The Doomhammer ability doesn't work against things that are not monsters and vehicles, and the Bane Sword actually has a really similar gun to the Storm Sword, but D6 plus 2 is doing the same or more damage as a Bane Sword 5/6 of the time for every attack. Every now and then you will be sad that you rolled a 1 on the damage, however, that's still going to be 3 damage into any given target, which is going to kill all but the most durable of infantry. But the other major reason why we care about the Storm Sword having the best gun is because it allows us to split fire most effectively. If we know we're shooting a Storm Sword at a Leman Russ, which currently has a 75% chance to kill, that means we are way less likely to need to put the las cannons into the same target, and those las cannons can shoot at a second Leman Russ. Those las cannons can shoot at a second Chimera. The heavy bolters can shoot at a third target, which they will oftentimes do anyway. But we need our super heavy to be killing more than 1 unit per turn on average. So the ability to split fire because we have the best gun is incredibly relevant. Now let's go ahead and invert this and talk about why we hate the Shadow Sword. So the first thing is that the Shadow Sword only has 1 target it can shoot at basically ever. It needs to be shooting at monsters and vehicles. And there are lots of armies that don't really bring any durable monsters and vehicles, right? If we're taking our Shadow Sword to blow up a Rhino, great, a normal Leman Russ could have done that. We need it to be shooting at really hard targets for the Shadow Sword to be interesting. However, even against these targets, it's worse than a Storm Sword. So as we just established, it has a lower percent chance to kill all of the targets that we were looking at. And even worse, it has a significantly higher chance of doing absolutely nothing. The Storm Sword and Bane Sword have 2% chances to do 0 damage to a Leman Russ or a Land Raider, and only a 4% chance to do absolutely no damage to a Knight. If we flip this, the Shadow Sword has a 16% chance to do absolutely no damage. That is unacceptable for a unit that we are spending 600 plus points on. Could you imagine if 600 points of Leman Russes did no damage for an entire turn? I mean, on the one hand, that's incredibly unlucky, but because the number of dice we're rolling for Shadow Sword is so low in the first place, it's going to happen way more often. So if we're considering the situation where our Shadow Sword is trying to shoot 5 turns in a game, we are now more likely than not to have at least one of those turns the Shadow Sword is just going to whiff. And not just whiff, not kill the target, whiff as in do no damage to the target. If you are trying to compete, we can absolutely not afford this kind of risk. And then one of the things that we mentioned earlier as well is what happens if you happen to have a Shadow Sword and you're playing up against Crew Hunting Pack, or maybe you're playing up against Infantry Bridgehead. Your Shadow Sword is now a massive liability because it's not doing anything. Now, if you're trying to take this to a teams event, you can consider it, but at that point, like, there are still better options to take. I'm sorry, Shadow Sword lovers, your tank sucks. Now I'm going to go ahead and talk about some of the counter arguments that I've heard whenever I've tried to have this conversation, especially on Reddit. But Joushi, what about the heavy keyword? If you don't move and you have take aim, you go from hitting on 4s to hitting on 2s. Great. So in order to use the heavy keyword, you now need to have exposed your tank already. This tank needs to be in a firing line to start with. If you do this on turn 1, your engine seer has not been able to go up, and there are a lot of armies in the game that can just kill a super heavy before it has an invul available to it. We are not risking that much of our list turn 1. Then after that, we need to have at least one turn moving it, so the first volley is not going to have heavy, and the first volley is usually the most important one. But then, Joushi, what about Scout Sentinels? That's an argument you can make for literally every tank. This is not special about the Shadow Sword, guys. I'm sorry, it's not a good tank. Okay, let's start talking about some of the other variants and why you would consider them and in what metas you would consider taking one of these over the Storm Sword. The Bane Blade and the Bane Sword are both pretty versatile tanks as well. The Bane Blade actually has just a ton of guns. It is probably the best split-firing super heavy that we have and arguably one of the best split-firing units in the entire game. They are very target agnostic just in general. They do have like ideal targets, like the Bane Blade prefers to shoot at 3-wound infantry, and the Bane Sword likes shooting at light vehicles like armigers, war dogs, and rhinos. So if you really need to shave off a couple of points, these are the ones that you would generally go to. They aren't as good as the Storm Sword, but they are almost as good. And the Bane Sword ability matters a lot if you happen to be like in a transport meta where there's just a lot of transports around, or you're having to play up against Chaos Knights or Imperial Knights where you're trying to kill armigers and war dogs. Those mortals that you can do to everything else can stack up pretty quickly. However, again, you only take these ones if you are trying to hunt those specific metas, or you really just need like those extra 20 points. Next, the other one that we consider is the Stormlord, but this one is only really valuable in mechanized assault. The Stormlord gun itself is terrible, but the tank has a pretty good rule. One of the things we've said in the past is that a unit of Ogryn inside a Chimera using firing deck is getting 18 heavy bolter shots. That's basically a Stormlord gun, but we are trying to do it for way cheaper. If the Stormlord was significantly cheaper, like this gun would be more interesting. But the rule, mount up, is really nice. At the end of your opponent's movement phase, if you have an infantry unit wholly within 6 of the transport, you can just go back into the transport. This makes it a very useful mobile base for Ogryn and Ratlings and Scions as well, where using mechanized assault, you hop out of the transport, you get your +1 to wound, you kill something, and then at the end of your opponent's movement phase, you basically have a free stratagem to get units back on the transports. If you do this with Scions or Ogryn, they're generally going to have a couple of extra useful activations, and the Ratlings, of course, can hop out and then hop back into the Stormlord. This is kind of memey, and you're spending a lot of points on a vehicle that really doesn't contribute that much to your damage, but if you're smart about your positioning and you can get your Ogryn and Scions and Ratlings to be firing multiple turns, sometimes that extra durability can be worthwhile. Okay, the last individual one that I'm going to talk about is the Doomhammer, and the Doomhammer is in a weird jack of all trades spot, but it has one thing that it's really good at. So the fact that it's a transport means that it is playable in mechanized assault, but it's just worse than the Stormlord in almost every way, unless you really need more anti-tank in that detachment. It has a short range. 24-inch range can be far enough, but it's oftentimes not. And the good firing deck, again, makes it kind of funny to put like heavy weapons teams and things inside. However, the main draw about the Doomhammer is that the Melta 6 is a modifier which happens after damage reduction. And so the Doomhammer is weirdly effective against things like Catan and the Avatar of Cain. Things that will half your damage, because it'll effectively be a D3 plus 6 damage weapon. So if you happen to be playing in like early 2024 when there was a ton of Satan spam all around, the Doomhammer would be good. But if that meta were to come back again, the Doomhammer is one of the ones that become way more interesting. Because of this, the Doomhammer is more meta dependent than other variants. It still has a fair number of shots with the main gun, so it's still like reasonably target agnostic with preferred targets. However, just as compared to the Bane Sword and the Bane Blade and the Storm Sword, it is going to do less damage on average into the majority of targets that we would shoot it at. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about the orders and stratagems that we can use on Super Heavies, and it's a fairly short list. The first one is take aim. You need to do this every turn. One of the main reasons why Super Heavies were completely dead for a while is that we could not order them and we were just losing the game to the smoke keyword. If our opponent had an ability to make us -1 to hit, suddenly 4, 5, 600 points of our army is hitting on 5s, which is incredibly inconsistent at best. So you're trying to do this every turn. As a backup, sometimes you will give move, but this usually means that you miss position previously, and it's worth noting that Super Heavies moved 12 base now. In the index, I think they only moved 9, maybe it was 10, but either way, it is a significant change to our ability to move around already. One of the major problems with playing Super Heavies is that most stratagems that we have in Astra Militarum simply don't work. Super Heavies don't have the squadron keyword, which is one of the things that a lot of abilities in Astra Militarum actually key off of. For instance, the Hammer Auto Advance 6 is something that only works if you're a squadron. Lethal hits and combined arms only works if you have the squadron keyword. And there's a ton of stratagems that we have that generally say excluding Titanic units. The other one is that Titanic units cannot overwatch. This was a change made a long time ago targeting Eldar, and this is just one of the knock-on effects that we had from the early 10th edition. So let's talk about the stratagems you can use. Both of the ones that we can do are in the Hammer of the Emperor detachment. Ablative plating for -1 damage, 2 CP, still very good if you're trying to keep it alive, especially against damage 2 or damage 3 shots. The other one is Crash Through, another Hammer of the Emperor strat, which allows you to move through walls. Smokescreen is going to be one that you're going to be doing fairly often, and then Tank Shock, if you get into range to charge something with your Baneblade, it's actually kind of worth using Tank Shock because you're going to fairly consistently be doing 4 or 5 mortals in the Tank Shock. So let's talk about how you should generally be using your Super Heavies. First thing that Super Heavies do is they control space. Any firing lane that a Super Heavy can get to is one that we are threatening to win. A Super Heavy should be threatening to kill at least one hard target, and sometimes 2 hard targets in the same turn. You can shoot your main gun at one target, and you can shoot the las cannons at another target, and then you can shoot the heavy bolters at a third target. This means we're going to be doing a ton of damage to Marines. This means we're going to be absolutely shredding any 3-up-8 vehicles, and if the Super Heavy can get there, we are going to win that firing lane. Use this to prevent your opponent from moving to places where they can interact with your midboard skirmishers. One of the major things that you'll need to do with this is identify very early on in the game, can I move my Super Heavy into the middle of the board? If you can, you should try to do so. You can nearly entirely cover a lot of objectives just by using the massive 7-inch by 9-inch footprint that the Super Heavy is going to have. And being OC8 is a big deal. You'll know very early on if your opponent can kill a Super Heavy or not, because they will usually have like tanks with laser destroyers and las cannons, or just a bunch of units of tank bustas and shock attack guns, or like Oath of Moment Vindicators. If your opponent doesn't have these and doesn't have scary things in melee, just move the Super Heavy into the middle of the board. Your goal is a Super Heavy should be able to shoot onto at least 2 of the 3 No Man's Land objectives on any given turn, and if you can shoot onto all 3, fantastic. However, because they are so big, it's usually going to be pretty telegraphed which objectives the Super Heavy is going to try and stand on. Next, Super Heavies need skirmishing units. Because the Super Heavy is supposed to be so good at shooting, and it'll kill or seriously damage anything it gets to shoot at, your opponent is going to hide from this unit. So we want to try and make sure that our opponent has to bring out their army to play with us so that we can actually shoot it. In order to do that, we need skirmishing units. Now, the last time the Super Heavies were good, this was mostly Kazarkin and Bulgrin. Nowadays, it's Kazarkin, Engineers, Katachan, Torax, Hellhound, Chimeras, things like that, where you run around, you're going to kill your opponent's MSU, things like Scout Marines or Infiltrators or Striking Scorpions or Flayed Ones. You're going to go try and kill those units so that the rest of their army actually has to come out and show themselves. We need to win the skirmish game in order to make Super Heavies good. Lastly, the favorite detachments of the Super Heavy. You can play them in any detachment, but these are the ones that have the most synergy with the Super Heavies. Firstly, Hammer of the Emperor. This is the only one that has stratagems that we can actually use on a Super Heavy, and it gets increased mobility from Crash Through. Note that the Advance and Shoot and the Fallback and Shoot stratagems do not work on Super Heavies because it does not have the squadron keyword. But because this tank isn't benefiting from lethal hits anyway, getting the extra mobility on the rest of our army can be very effective. The next one is Siege Regiment. You can use the smoke shells to stealth your own vehicles. So just having a Super Heavy that has a permanent smoke screen just on it, and the constant stealth available to it does mean that you're going to win a lot more shootouts in the Siege Regiment than you would in a couple of other detachments. Lastly, Mechanized Assault. As we touched on, the Stormlord is probably a build around and something that you can do with success in Mechanized Assault, and the Doomhammer also has some play as well, though it's just a weaker version of the Stormlord for these purposes. The other detachments you can play it in, but we're rapidly approaching Y. It's just not going to be better than a lot of other things that we can do in these detachments. Now, at this point, the astute among you might be remembering when we showed the Super Heavy tier list, there is a blank spot at the top, and that's because the best Super Heavy is 3 Vanquishers that you duct tape together. All of the things that we have said Super Heavies can do are things that 3 Vanquishers or 2 Rogel Dorns can also do. And 3 Vanquishers is going to be on par for price with our cheapest Super Heavies. And 2 Rogel Dorn Battle Tanks is also going to be on par with a lot of the Super Heavies that we're bringing. Everything we've said that a Super Heavy can do, 3 Vanquishers are also going to be able to do by controlling space. They're going to be controlling firing lanes. Same thing with 2 Rogel Dorns. Everything we've said a Super Heavy can do, you can also do with other tanks in Imperial Guard. Now, I'm not telling you don't take a Super Heavy. The Storm Sword, in particular, is actually pretty viable, depending on what terrain you're playing on, of course. And if you're just there to have a good time, absolutely look into taking a Storm Sword. However, I can't really in good conscience tell you, you should take a Super Heavy, because they are just not quite as good as just taking the same number of points in normal tanks that we'd be looking at. But with that in mind, I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Officer Training School. My name has been Joshua Joushi Howard. Current password is Ratlings if you're trying to get into the Discord, and we'll see you guys all next time.